Chapter 18 of Concepts of Biology book and Chapter 43 of Biology 2nd edition covers the reproductive system. Now, it is appropriate to cover the reproductive system because it is the application of what you have already studied, meiosis. So meiosis applies to the formation of gametes, the formation of sex cells, egg, and sperm. What's the function of the reproductive system? Correct. All right. So let's keep this in mind. The purpose of the reproductive system are the babies. So we're going to take it down and break it down. And how did we go from meiosis, the formation of sex cells, the sperm and the egg, or also called ovum, and to how do we end up with a little baby? We are following the outline for the material in Chapter 43 of Biology 2nd edition. It follows the order I want to present the material for you. And we, for simplicity purpose, are going to just concentrate on human reproductive systems. So you are not responsible for knowing other eukaryotic organisms and the reproductive strategy. So don't worry about anything but human reproductive system. So the outline for the PowerPoint is human male reproductive system, and then we'll see how those organs aid in the meiosis, gametogenesis of the sperm, the spermatogenesis. We'll look at human female reproductive systems and the organs that aid in the development of the ovum. And so meiosis applied to the formation of the egg, the ovum. And then control of human reproduction. We'll end with a little bit of an introduction to human embryo development. So for sexual reproduction, we're looking at the formation of the egg and sperm and how that's going to lead to the offspring or a zygote fertilized egg, which will result in a human, a baby human. So the gametes, the sperm and the egg, are formed in specialized reproductive organs called the gonads. For males, that's the testes, so sperm are formed in the testes, and for females, those are called the ovaries. Humans are dioecious, so they're separate sexes where these gametes are formed. The egg of one parent is fertilized by sperm of another, an event called fertilization, and this is done by means of copulation, that's sexual union, to facilitate this fertilization event. And we'll go over where fertilization takes place in the female reproductive system and how the sperm is able to deliver the paternal DNA so it can mix with maternal DNA. Mammals are viviparous, that means that they give life to, they do live birth. And so the female reproductive organs are so that they are able to nourish and protect a developing embryo and fetus into the point of birth or parturition. There's the care of the zygote embryo, and so there's a specialized organ that is formed from fetal cells called the placenta that will help in nourishing the developing embryo and fetus until birth. It is an intermediate organ between maternal blood contents and fetal blood contents. We'll begin with the male reproductive system, and we'll start with the testes inside the scrotum. And if we look inside the lower right left-hand corner, we see that inside the testes, we have a series of tubules. So the sperm are forming in what's known as seminiferous tubules. Seminiferous tubules. They form on the edge of the tubule, and as they mature, they are undergoing meiosis, meiotic division. They move towards the lumen, the hollow end of the tubule, and that's where they start maturation. It takes about 9 weeks for a sperm to form from a spermatogonium, or the initial cell, stem cell, and then for us to get 4 sperm cells. And so from the seminiferous tubules, the sperm will go into this network of tubules called a rete tubule, and then retetestes to the straight tubules, and the network of tubules will unwind to one single tubule. So this network of tubules here is called the epididymis, and unwinds to one single tube called the vas deferens. Okay, so if we go over here to this image, we have the seminiferous tubules inside the testes. the epididymis, this is the travel path of sperm, to the vas deferens. The vas deferens ascends into the body cavity. It goes behind the urinary bladder. It passes by a couple of glands that are called accessory glands. That means they're going to help in the development, nourishment of that sperm. And so we have the seminal vesicles. We have the prostate gland, which is located inferiorly beneath the urinary bladder, prostate gland. And so the sperm are traveling through the urethra. At this point, it's called the urethra. That's prostatic urethra. And then it goes to the penile urethra. And then it passes this organ called the bulbourethral gland. And then out through the urethral opening. We have the penis, and then the end of the penis called the glans penis. As the sperm are developing in the seminiferous tubules, they are not fully mature, or they don't have that final sperm look until they travel through the epididymis and the vas deferens. As they're traveling, the accessory glands are going to provide nourishment and other substances that will aid in the sperm's journey, so to speak. And so the sperm plus the fluids that are released from the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland is what makes up seminal fluid. So as a summary, we have male reproductive system, and we have the table that on the left that shows you the organ, and on the right that shows you the function. And just a couple of differences. Vas deferens is the same as vasa differentia. So sperm are developing in the testes. They're going to mature once they get to the epididymis. And maturation means that they're going to develop that flagellum. Remember that sperm are the only cells in the human body, either female or male. So in the male body that have a flagellum. And so they'll develop into and have that flagellum while they're maturing in the epididymis. They travel to the vas deferentia or vas deferens. Then seminal vesicles, prostate gland, and bulbourethral gland will contribute to the fluid of the sperm that are traveling through these structures. Remember that sperm, because they have the flagellum, they're motile. However, they don't have the right motility. They're not able to really move until they go through a process called capacitation, which is actually occurs in the vagina. And so they actually aren't fully motile until they have this process. And then penis is the organ of copulation. And we have just a little bit of a summary here as well. Testes and spermatogenesis. So spermato refers to the sperm, genesis to form, right? Beginnings, so to form. So spermatogenesis is how the development of the sperm. The testis contains those seminiferous tubules. The sperm are going to mature in the periphery, the outside of the tubule, and then migrate into the lumen as they go through the meiotic division. So mature sperm actually have three pieces. We have the head, and on the tip of the head we have what's known as acrosome or acrosomal cap. These have enzymes that are going to aid the sperm in delivering paternal DNA into the egg cell, so the ova. Then we have the middle piece or mid piece. This is a concentration of mitochondria. Why do you think there's mitochondria here? All right, so let's look at the third structure. The third structure is the tail. And what does the tail do? Move in whip-like movements. So it's cytoskeletal elements, and it moves, but it cannot move unless it's supplied with energy, and that energy supply comes from that mid piece, the concentration of mitochondria. So again, testes, that's where they form, but they develop into this final appearance that we know as spermatogonia, spermatozoa, pardon me, spermatozoa, as they mature in the epididymis. So how do we apply meiosis to the formation of sperm? We call this spermatogenesis, the formation of sperm. So we have in the seminiferous tubules, at the periphery, we have stem cells. These stem cells are called spermatogonium. They're stem cells because they produce more themselves and they produce cells that will become the sperm. So through mitosis, they produce a clone of themselves, and these clones, these daughter cells, could undergo meiotic division and become sperm. So via meiosis 1, we have that diploid cell, has a full set of chromosomes, become haploid cells, has one N each. So two cells, we call these secondary spermatocytes. Then we have meiosis 2. Meiosis 2, we have these two haploid cells. There's no more DNA duplication or anything like that. These two haploid cells divide, and so we have meiosis 2 yield 4 cells. We call these 4 cells spermatids. I see these 4 cells do not look like the sperm cells we know of. So this is happening here at the seminiferous tubules, and as they're going through the meiotic division, they're migrating towards the lumen, the center of the tube, and then they'll travel through that network of tubules. So differentiation is going to be where these cells start maturing and looking like these sperm cells we know. So we have 4 sperm cells with the 3 pieces, the head with the acrosome, the midpiece, and the flagella. And so we know these are sperm, and they become motile as they're traveling through the male reproductive tract, and they don't gain full motility until they're in and mix in with vaginal fluid. So for female reproductive system, again, we're concentrating on human, we have the organs, the ovaries, the oviducts, or also called fallopian tubes, the uterus, which we also know as the womb, and the vagina. So looking at the diagram of these female reproductive structures, figure A on the left, we have a lateral view, a side view of the female reproductive structures, and on the right, we have a frontal view, looking straight front view. So we have internal structures and external structures. The external structures include the clitoris, the labia minora, labia majora, and the internal structures include the uterus, the ovary, the fallopian tube that you can't really see here in this lateral view. So the uterus leads to the cervix and then the vagina. On the frontal view, we have the uterus right here in the center. Off to the side, we have the fallopian tubes. In blue, we have the ovaries. Then the uterus here leads to the cervix, and then the vagina, and then the external structures. The ovaries is where gametogenesis takes place, or more specifically for eggs, oogenesis. Oogenesis. Now here's an interesting fact. It takes 9 weeks for sperm to form. How long does it take eggs to form, ova to form? Okay, let's just start by saying that meiosis, egg formation, oogenesis begins before a female fetus is born. So it begins in utero. Then it stops. It's halted up until puberty, and then it proceeds. But not all cells proceed their meiotic division. Most cells are not. Only a few cells are going to proceed meiotic division. So meiosis really takes years to decades for females, for the eggs to form. Whereas for males, spermatogenesis takes about 9 weeks, and it's a continuous process. For females, there's about 500,000 eggs already in a suspended form of meiosis in the ovaries when a female fetus is born, and those are all the eggs that will ever form. Okay, so ovaries release ova, that's a plural word for egg, ovum, and then the ovaries also produce estrogen and progesterone. These are hormones that are aiding in the development of the eggs. For males, it was testosterone that's going to aid in the development of sperm. So for the eggs, the formation of eggs, we call this the ovarian cycle. Okay, so that means that it's a pattern that repeats. And so here we have a diagram of the time frame for the cycle. On average, a cycle may be about 28 days. It varies from female to female, but the average will be 28 days. So what happens in those 28 days? We have day 1, we have the egg forming inside a layer of cells. That layer of cells is called a follicle or follicular cells. Okay, and as the egg matures, grows, the layer of cells around the egg also grows. So that's called the follicle. So we have, for the first 2 weeks, the follicular phase. This is where a couple of hormones are aiding in this development, one being follicle stimulating hormone. Now there's follicle stimulating hormones in males too. We'll come back to the hormones later in the lecture. So follicle stimulating hormone promotes development of follicle. Those are the layers of cells around the egg. And then it releases estrogen. Around day 14, midway through the cycle, the egg inside the layer follicles, this is the egg right here, ovum, inside the layer follicles, is going to be released. It's released from the ovary and it's going to be swept into the fallopian tube. Okay, it's going to be swept into the fallopian tube. The follicle remains inside the ovary, so that layer of cells remains. And it's a very important structure because it's still secreting hormones that are aiding in this development or this process. So the ovum is released. That's called ovulation, and that's midway through the cycle at day 14. The other 2 weeks for the cycle is called the luteal phase. Okay, so the luteal phase, we have luteinizing hormone promotes development of corpus luteum. This is corpus luteum right here. So the empty follicle is now called corpus luteum. Corpus luteum secretes progesterone. That's an important hormone that will help the uterus be ready for a possible embryo implantation. Progesterone is being secreted with the idea that the egg will be fertilized, and so we'll get a zygote, a fertilized egg, and that fertilized zygote, that fertilized egg, will travel through the fallopian tube into the uterus and implant. And it implants that we're going to have an embryo develop into a fetus, and with the idea of a live birth after 9 months or 40 weeks. Here we have the ovarian cycle, oogenesis, and ovulation. So remember, we're looking at meiosis applied to the egg. And so we have, starting with the meiotic division, we have oogonia. Through mitosis, we have the primary oocyte. Okay, so this happens before birth, before a female fetus is born. We have these cells, oogonia, mature and give rise through mitosis to primary oocyte. Now, oogonia is not a stem cell because it's not continuously giving rise to more oocytes. So these cells are arrested in prophase 1. They stop. Prophase 1 stops. It's going to be a period of silence until the female reaches puberty. During puberty, the first menstrual cycle is called menarche, and that's when the hormones are being released that are going to lead to maturation of the eggs. But again, remember, it's only 500,000 eggs to begin with. And during this period, just 2 or 3 eggs are going to start developing. So they come out of prophase 1, they move on to metaphase 1, and then anaphase 1, and so forth, right? Now, let's continue this. Meiosis continues. We have meiosis 1 finishes. We have the 2 cells that form from meiosis 1 called secondary oocytes. They stay arrested. Another pause at metaphase 2. Metaphase 2. These cells will not finish metaphase 2 unless there is fertilization. So that's what we have next. Metaphase 2. These cells are still in the ovary. Then we're going to have ovulation. Ovulation, only one of these 2 or 3 cells that have reached metaphase 2, only one of these cells will be released. So normally, one ovary will release 1 egg into the fallopian tube because during ovulation, this it's during this time, it's a period between 12 to 24 hours that the egg, the oocyte, can be fertilized. So the period of about 12 to 24 hours that the egg can be fertilized. And if it's fertilized, it will be fertilized in this first part of the fallopian tube, also called the oviduct. So we have a sperm. One sperm reaches it. This is one end. The sperm is one end. And so we have meiosis continued. Remember, it was arrested at metaphase 2, but now the sperm contributed one end, so half the chromosomes from dad, and then half the chromosomes from mom. Now we have 2N, meiosis completes, and we have fertilized 2N cell. We call this fertilized 2N cell, diploid cell, a zygote. Now recall that meiosis 1 yields 2 cells. One cell is called the secondary oocyte. It's a lot bigger than the second cell. The second cell is called a polar body. This cell will eventually just die off, degenerate. Then the product of meiosis 2, again, we have ovulation and fertilization take place. The product of meiosis 2 will be a total of 4 cells. 1 fertilized egg, and then 3 polar bodies. Again, those 3 polar bodies will degenerate, will die off. And then we do have a fairly large fertilized egg cell, because recall that this cell is not only do we have maternal DNA, paternal DNA mixing, and then we have genetic variation taking place to produce a genetically unique individual, but we also have the egg, fertilized egg, the zygote, that's going to nourish this developing embryo until the placenta develops, and then the placenta could take over that job. Now, reproduction, the reproductive system, the reproduction is driven by the endocrine system, and the endocrine system are our hormonal system. So it's one of the communication methods in our body. We have our brain and the nervous system that it communicates. It's sending signals to cells for it to move. My brain's telling my hand to move, so it's directing my skeletal muscles to move my hand. That's one communication system. Another communication system is the endocrine system. So the body's communicating with other tissues via hormones, chemicals that are found in very small amounts but have very big effects. So the master endocrine gland is in the brain. And so we have a lateral view, a side view of the brain here, and then we have a zoomed in picture here. And the master endocrine gland is called the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the master endocrine gland. It directs the activity of the pituitary gland, And so the hypothalamus directs the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases hormones that aid in the development of the sperm and egg by directing the tissue where the sperm and egg are formed in the gonads. So we have the pituitary gland secretes hormones that cause reproductive organs to secrete their hormones. So what are the gonadal hormones? In the ovaries, again, we have progesterone and estrogen, and then we have another hormone called inhibin, because that one inhibits or will stop the process. And then in males, we have testosterone and inhibin as well, because that hormone will stop the whole process as well. So this reproductive system is driven by the endocrine system. And puberty is when these reproductive hormones start being released, and hence puberty, you see the development of the more of adult form of our species, right? So let's take a look at how that functions. For hormone regulation in males, we have the hypothalamus releases a hormone to cause the anterior pituitary gland to release their hormones. So the anterior pituitary gland secretes 2 hormones called follicular stimulating hormone, abbreviated FSH, and luteinizing hormone that affect the testes. Follicular stimulating hormone affects Sertoli cells, and the Sertoli cells facilitate spermatogenesis. Okay, so they're the ones that are helping with maturation and development of the sperm. Likewise, the luteinizing hormone is targeting the Leydig cells that are secreting testosterone. and testosterone will have an effect on Sertoli cells. And then testosterone, again, the secretion of it will inhibit the release of hormones from the hypothalamus and from the anterior pituitary gland. So it's called a negative feedback system, that once we have these hormones released, they stop their own release. All right. So hypothalamus has ultimate control of testicular sexual function. Gonadotropic releasing hormones released from the hypothalamus to anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes FSH and LH. FSH promotes spermatogenesis. It's all in the seminiferous tubules. Luteinizing hormone controls production of testosterone. The release of the testosterone will come back and inhibit release of the GnRH and the LH and FSH. And so this is what's known as a negative feedback cycle. So for female reproductive system, it is also regulated by the endocrine system. And so we'll see similar hormones being released. We have from the hypothalamus releasing hormone that stimulates the pituitary gland to release FSH and a luteinizing hormone, LH. But for the females, there are two events occurring at the same time. We have the ovarian cycle, and that's explaining what's happening with the egg, the ovum, and the follicles. And then we also have at the same time the uterine cycle, and that's explaining what's happening in the uterus, because the uterus is also undergoing changes that it's going to facilitate the growth of a embryo and fetus. So we'll start with the ovarian cycle. For the ovarian cycle, we have the first 14 days. We call that the follicular phase. Follicular phase because a follicle is forming. The egg is inside with undergoing meiotic division, the first meiotic division, and then we have layers of cells forming around the egg, and then a space, a cavity, fluid-filled cavity. So this is called the follicular phase. The follicle grows. Midway, the egg is released. The follicle releases the egg. The follicle stays in the ovary. The egg is released and it'll be swept into the fallopian tube. And then we have the luteal phase, and the luteal phase shows you the development of the corpus luteum. So the empty follicle becomes what's known as a corpus luteum. So corpus luteum forms, and then it's going to degenerate. But before it degenerates, it's secreting progesterone. It continues to secrete progesterone. And so we have follicular phase, the first 2 weeks. FSH is stimulating, it's being released from the pituitary gland, and it's stimulating follicle maturation, and then luteinizing, and then estrogen too, formation and secretion of estrogen. And then midway at day 14 of a 28-day cycle, we have an LH spike. So a surge of luteinizing hormones released from the anterior pituitary gland, which causes ovulation, causes the ovary, the follicle inside the ovary to release that egg. So for luteal phase, days 15 to 28, luteinizing hormone will now decrease. Corpus luteum will secrete progesterone. And again, this is going to affect what's going on with the uterine cycle. So for the uterine cycle, again, it's happening concurrently at the same time with the ovarian cycle. The first week is menstruation. So day 1 is the woman's first menstrual day, okay? And it could last up to 5. Again, it varies, so we're just going on averages. And so here, menstruation is when the endometrium breaks down. So the lining of the uterus has thickened and extra cells have grown in anticipation from the previous month of an implantation of an embryo. That didn't happen, so the uterus walls breaks down. Extra blood vessels that grew in to supply the new cell growth, they close off, and we have what's known as a woman's menstrual blood flow. So day 1 to 5, endometrium breaks one. The inner lining of the uterus breaks down, and we have what's known as the menses or menstrual cycle. Then from day 6 to day 13, the endometrium starts building up. So again, new cells are growing, and to supply nourishment to the new cells, we have new vessels also growing. And so we have this as known as the proliferative phase. Proliferate means to divide, for cells to continuously divide. So we have the proliferative phase. The endometrium is thickening. Ovulation usually occurs on day 14 during this phase. And so the rest of the uterine cycle, day 15 to 28, the endometrium continues to grow. So it doubles and thickens. And again, it's in preparation for a potential fertilized egg, an embryo to implant, and then it will be nourished and protected and grow inside the endometrium, the uterus, also known as the womb. Putting it together, we have the follicle grows, the menstrual flow for the first 5 or so days, then the proliferative phase along with the continuation of the follicle growing. Midway, day 14 of a 28-day cycle, the follicle releases the egg into the fallopian tube, and then the uterus, the inner lining of the uterus, the endometrium, starts thickening and continues to thicken during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Again, the corpus luteum, that empty follicle, is producing progesterone, which is causing this thickening. It's stimulating this thickening of the uterus, the inner lining of the uterus. Now, the corpus luteum will degenerate, will completely get destroyed. That means that progesterone levels will drop. As we see here, progesterone in green drops. It's this drop that will start the next cycle where the first day of the next cycle is menstruation, the breaking down of that inner lining of the uterus. Okay, and then so we have for the bottom two graphs, the hormones associated with the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Day of menstruation, here we have the middle 14, we have a spike of luteinizing hormone and FSH, and then estradiol will start dropping, but then progesterone continues, and that's keeping that thickened endometrium. But again, that drops, and so we begin the next cycle where we'll repeat these events. Hormonal control ovaries, menopause, signifies the last menstrual cycle of a female, for a female. The first menstrual cycle is called menarche. The last menstrual cycle is called menopause. So what happens in menopause? There's less sensitivity to follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So menstrual period becomes less frequent until it finally stops. Eggs and potential follicles are still present in the ovaries, but they cannot be released or they cannot continue their cycle without the stimulation of SSH and LH. Okay? So there won't be a release of a viable egg. And this will lead to an inability to have children because the eggs are not being released and they haven't gone through the maturation process because there's an insensitivity to those hormones. Pregnancy signifies a successful fertilization event that created a zygote, a fertilized egg cell. So we had paternal DNA mixed with maternal DNA, and one sperm deposited one set of paternal DNA and mixed with maternal DNA. That fertilized egg is called a zygote. The zygote now moves through the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube or the oviduct. So day 0 is fertilization. Day 1, we have that zygote. The cell becomes 2 cell stage. 2 cells become 4 cell stage. 8 cells become 4 cells become 8, then 32, 64, etc. until it becomes a ball of cells called a blastula. And this ball of cells will implant about a week after fertilization into that inner lining of the uterus called the endometrium. That's called implantation. Just a couple notes before I move on. This egg is immotile. It does not move. It doesn't have the structures to move. But the lining of the uterus, of the uterine tube, has cilia. The cells have cilia, and they're moving in unison to sweep the egg to its location. It's also another reason why smoking affects pregnancy and fertilization, because smoking affects cilia. It freezes cilia. It inhibits cilia from moving. And if you inhibit the cilia, the fertilized egg cannot move to its location to implant and have a successful pregnancy. So pregnancy, we have in humans, fertilization occurs soon after the oocyte leaves the ovary. Implantation occurs about 8 days after. And then the corpus luteum, recall the corpus luteum, is secreting progesterone. This is going to maintain that thickened endometrium, thickened uterine wall. The placenta will form and originates from both maternal and embryonic tissue. And the placenta will produce human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. It is this hormone that's detected in urine for a pregnancy test. Okay, so the corpus luteum needs to be active, not degenerate, not get destroyed, remain active, secreting progesterone until the placenta forms and begins producing the hormones necessary to sustain life. Okay, we have here an image of a rapidly growing fetus. This would be the third trimester. Here's the uterine wall, the placenta, and the link between the maternal nutrients and products and fetal products is the umbilical cord. So maternal blood, I should say, and fetal blood never mix. We have the placenta that acts as an intermediate. The fetal structure, there's metabolic activity occurring. There are metabolic waste products taking place. Carbon dioxide is being produced. That needs to be removed. Oxygen is needed by the developing fetus. That needs to come in. So via the placenta, we have maternal blood delivering oxygen, picking up carbon dioxide, delivering nutrients, and so these oxygen, these nutrients are going to travel through the umbilical cord, the blood vessels umbilical cord, and nourish the developing fetus. Infertility is the inability of a couple to achieve pregnancy after 1 year of regular unprotected intercourse. This could be due to the male, female, or both. Common causes include endometriosis, so problems with the uterus, and sometimes there's growth in the uterus that needs to be removed, or there's scar tissue. Males could have low sperm count, etc. So there are assisted reproductive technologies. We won't get into too much detail. And so these assisted reproductive technologies includes artificial insemination by donor, as where there's a donation, a sperm donor that the sperm will be injected into the female. This could also include in vitro fertilization, where eggs are removed from the female and then sperm are removed from the male, and their sperm and egg are allowed to potentially fertilize, the sperm potentially fertilize one egg on a petri dish. Once you have the fertilized zygotes, the fertilized eggs, the embryos, then they're implanted into a woman's uterine wall. Gamete intrafallopian transfer. This is where the sperm and egg are collected and then inserted into the female fallopian tube so natural fertilization can take place, not outside but inside the female reproductive organs. And then intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Again, it's inserting that sperm directly into an egg, so facilitating the fertilization event. And so these are just a little overview of the assisted reproductive technologies to overcome either hormonal inability to have a successful pregnancy, or sometimes structural. The anatomy might not be conducive to a successful pregnancy or fertilization event. Once there is a successful fertilization event, again, we start with the fertilization event in this ampulla, this end of the fallopian tube. Then that one cell becomes 2 cells becomes 4, 4, 8, 8, 32, 64, until it becomes a ball of cells. Then we call this ball of cells the blastula with a hollow end in the middle called a blastocele, and then the blastoderm, that outer layer of cells. Then we have a mass of cells called the inner cell mass, and the outer cells called the trophoblast as they develop. The inner cell mass will be, this is what's known as embryonic stem cells. So these cells become all the body cells, right? So they're pluripotent stem cells. Those are the ones that are sought after for research. And so that's, controversial topic of using these embryonic stem cells for research. And then the trophoblast will give rise to the placenta. The final event, this is called blastulation. We have gastrulation when you have that implantation of the embryo into the uterine wall. So here we have that another different image, the blastula, and then we have the gastrula. And then the gastrula, we have the formation of 3 layers of cells, the endoderm, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. And so these will give rise to all the body cells. Fetal development is shown in 9 weeks of gestation. Gestation is that period after fertilization takes place, where of the development of the embryo and the fetus. So gestation is those 40 weeks of development. And so we have at 9 weeks, we have an eye, foot, plate, ear canal, the limbs already forming, and then the hands, the fingers already formed, but there are still cells in between the fingers. And for the fingers to actually form, we have apoptosis that has to take place. Programmed cell death will take place to form the fingers. Then for figure B, we have the fetus entering second trimester. So placenta now takes over the role of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum can now degenerate. The placenta will take over and secrete the hormones necessary to have a successful gestational period. And so we have here the placenta, the umbilical cord, and the forming fetus. And now it's called fetus because the first 8 weeks of development, first trimester, and we call the forming fetus an embryo, and then we have the fetus. And then during the 3rd trimester, let me just mention that during the 2nd trimester, that's when we have a lot of organogenesis, organs forming, etc. And it's not until the 3rd trimester that we really see a growth in the baby from a 1-pound baby to an 8-pound baby at the end. So the 3rd trimester is really a lot of growth of the baby from a 1-pound fetus to an 8-pound. It's 7 average, but I had 8-pound babies. So an 8-pound baby. Okay, so a lot of growth during the 3rd trimester. And so we have here the placenta, the umbilical cord, and the fetus with already in position for birth. So what's the function of the reproductive system? Babies.